The winter winds screamed through the shattered concrete walls of the last base. Snow blanketed everything, the burned-out armor hulks, the snapped antenna poles, and the boot prints drawing closer through the valley. Inside the observation tower, the only sniper still alive checked her magazine. Empty. 1 round left. Through the scope, she counted dozens of enemy soldiers advancing across the frozen valley below. The wind threw ice crystals against the glass. Her breath fogged the eyepiece. Then she saw him, the man at the front of the column. The only person in the world who knew her real name. The storm had been building for 6 hours before it finally broke. Sergeant Elena Vasquez, call sign Ghost, designation classified, age 29. Currently, the last living defender of Firebase, Ardent pressed her back against the interior wall of the observation tower and listened to the structure groan around her. The concrete was old, Soviet-era construction. Somebody had told her once, retrofitted and refortified twice over the decades. It had survived artillery. It had survived a direct strike by a rocket-propelled grenade in the autumn of the previous year. Now it swayed faintly in the wind as if it were tired, as if it were considering simply sitting down in the snow. She understood the feeling. The base had been designed for a full company. 42 personnel at peak operational strength. When the enemy offensive had opened 11 days ago, Firebase Ardent had held 31. On day 3, resupply had been denied. On day 5, Command had authorized a tactical withdrawal. On day 7, the first attempt at evacuation had been turned back by weather and enemy fire. On day 8, the second attempt had been turned back by weather alone. On day 9, 8 of her remaining 11 comrades had fought their way out through the eastern corridor under the cover of a whiteout blizzard, carrying 2 wounded. On day 10, the 3 who remained, Vasquez, Corporal James Whitfield, and Private First Class Aaron Drury, had agreed that someone needed to stay. The observation tower controlled the only radio relay strong enough to bounce a signal over the mountains to the command post at Aldervale. Someone needed to maintain contact. Someone needed to keep the relay alive. Whitfield and Drury had argued about who would stay. Vasquez had not argued. She had simply picked up her rifle and climbed the tower. That had been 31 hours ago. She had spoken to command twice since then. The last contact had been 9 hours ago, when the relay had crackled back to life long enough for a senior operations officer whose name she didn't know to tell her in the measured, emotionless tone of someone reading from a prepared script that reinforcement was not possible before dawn of the following day. Possibly not before midday. Weather, road conditions, enemy interdiction of the approach routes. She had said, understood. She had not said, I have 14 rounds left. That had been 9 hours ago. She now had 1. Through the narrow observation, slit approximately 4 centimeters high, 30 centimeters wide, set into the eastern-facing wall, she could see the valley. Or rather, she could see the ghost of the valley, a smear of gray-white emptiness between 2 dark ridgelines, interrupted by the occasional dark mass of a pine tree bent sideways by the wind. The snow was coming horizontally now. Visibility was perhaps 400 meters. 400 meters. Long enough to see the shapes moving in the white. She had been watching them for the past hour. First as a suggestion, a darkness in the static of the blizzard, there and then gone again. Then more clearly, as the advancing line came within her range. Figures, moving in careful order, spaced roughly 8 meters apart, following the contour of the western ridge wall to stay out of the worst of the wind. She counted them by the gaps in the snow. 17, 22. She lost count above 30. Professional spacing, disciplined movement. They had done this before. She checked the rifle again. She did not know why she did this. She already knew what she would find. The magazine was empty. The spare was empty. The emergency reserve she had taped to the stock for the kind of situation she had never seriously expected to actually encounter was empty. In the chamber, 1 round. She set the rifle down across her knees and sat in the darkness and the cold and let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, the weight of the situation. She had learned this in training not from any official doctrine, but from the instructor who had first taught her to shoot. You are allowed to feel it, he had said. Fear is information. Despair is information. Let it come. Then let it pass. Then act. She felt it. The cold, which had long since moved past discomfort into something closer to background noise. The hunger she had eaten, the last of her rations 14 hours ago. The exhaustion that lived somewhere behind her eyes and made the shapes in the snow blur at the edges. The loneliness, which was its own specific weight, heavier than any of the others. 30 seconds. Then she lifted the rifle and pressed her eye to the scope and went back to work. In the leading element of the advancing column, one figure moved differently from the others. Not faster, if anything, slightly slower, but with a different quality of attention. The figure turned its head at regular intervals, scanned the ridges, adjusted the spacing of the soldiers ahead and behind, with small hand signals that the rest responded to immediately and without question. The figure walked with the unhurried certainty of someone who did not need to worry about who might be watching, because they already knew. Elena Vasquez had been watching that walk for 3 years. She would have recognized it through a blizzard at 500 meters with her eyes half closed. She went very still. The cold in the towers seemed to deepen. In the scope, through the snow and the fading winter light, the figure at the head of the enemy column turned its face toward the tower. And she heard, in her memory clear as the day it had been spoken, clearer than anything real, his voice. "You are the finest instrument I have ever made, Elena. But instruments can be broken. Remember that." The name had started as a joke. Private Elena Vasquez, age 22, 3rd year of service, recently transferred to the 14th Mountain Infantry from a conventional rifle unit, had executed a confirmed kill at 940 meters in a crosswind during a training exercise at the high-altitude range at Fort Kiernan. The range officer had stared at the target for a long time before recording the result. Someone in her platoon had said, "Where'd that shot come from? Nobody saw her. She's a ghost." By the following week, the name had spread to the adjacent barracks. By the end of her first deployment, it had reached command. Ghost of the Snow. The records showed 22 confirmed kills at distances exceeding 600 meters under adverse weather conditions over the course of 3 combat deployments. The actual number was higher. The unconfirmed kills, the ones made in conditions where confirmation was impossible, the shots taken through whiteouts and mountain fog, and the blue-gray dusk before a winter storm. Those she had stopped counting after the first deployment because counting them had begun to feel like something she didn't want to become. She was not a weapon who enjoyed being a weapon. That distinction mattered to her in ways she had never been able to fully articulate to anyone. The stories had grown, as stories do. Soldiers in forward positions who had been told there was a sniper covering their approach reported hearing nothing, no shot, no echo, just the wind, and then the target was down. A colonel in the Eastern Command had reportedly told a journalist that the Ghost of the Snow was a myth, a psychological operation, a rumor they spread to keep the enemy looking over their shoulders. He had said this entirely sincerely. He had not been briefed on her actual existence. There were things about the name that she hated. The way it made her into something other than a person. The way people who knew about her tended to look at her with a particular kind of reverence that she found exhausting and slightly obscene, as if she were a holy relic rather than a 29-year-old woman who was very good at one specific and terrible thing. There were things about it she had, over time, come to accept. The tactical value of that reverence. The way an enemy who believed in the ghost would hesitate, would cluster, would do predictable things in predictable patterns. Fear was a weapon like any other. She had learned to use it, but she had never wanted the name. She had never asked for any of it. She had wanted, at 22, to be a soldier who did her job and came home. She had wanted, at 25, to maybe finish her service and go back to school. Architecture, possibly. She had always found something clarifying about the relationship between load and structure, about the way a building had to honestly account for what it was carrying. At 27, she had stopped making plans. The mountains had a way of doing that. Or the work did. Or the winters. Or Colonel Marcus Holt did. She had met him at the beginning of her second deployment. He was 53 years old, built like a man who had never stopped training, with gray eyes that processed information the way a camera did, sweeping, recording, cataloging. He had requested her transfer to his unit personally. He had spent the first 2 weeks of her assignment pushing her past every limit she thought she had, finding new ones, pushing past those too. He had been the most demanding instructor she had ever encountered, and also, she had come to understand slowly, the most honest. He told her things that her previous instructors had left out. About what the work did to you over time. About the mechanisms you built to keep functioning and the costs of building them. About the difference between a soldier who killed and a killer who happened to wear a uniform, and why that distinction mattered more than any doctrine or regulation. She had trusted him more than she had trusted anyone. She brought the scope back to the valley. The figure at the head of the column had not changed direction. He was walking straight toward Firebase Ardent. She steadied her breathing and watched and tried to understand how the man who had taught her everything she knew about what it meant to be a soldier was now leading an enemy force through a mountain valley in the middle of a blizzard, toward the position she was holding. She did not have an answer. She had only the scope and the cold and one round and the memory of his voice. "You are the finest instrument I have ever made." On the morning of Day 8, before the second evacuation attempt had been authorized, Captain Dennis Yardley had gathered the remaining personnel of Firebase Ardent in the base's main briefing room, a concrete box with one working light and a map that was 4 months out of date, and told them what command had apparently decided they needed to know. Firebase Ardent was not, Yardley explained, merely a forward observation post. It had been selected for its position above a particular geological feature, a natural tunnel complex that ran for approximately 3 kilometers through the mountain's eastern face, emerging in a ravine that opened directly onto the approaches to the town of Kessler's Ridge, a settlement of roughly 4,000 civilians that also happened to contain the primary fuel and ammunition depot for the entire forward operational sector. The tunnel complex was known to very few people. It had not been an asset that required active defense, because it had not been an asset that was known to be at risk. The assumption had been that the enemy offensive would be contained well to the north. The assumption had been wrong. If the enemy reached Firebase Ardent, Yardley said, they would find the tunnel entrance in the eastern maintenance building within hours. Someone had provided them with detailed structural information about the base. There was an intelligence leak that had not yet been identified, and if they found the tunnel, they would be inside the defenses of Kessler's Ridge before any repositioning of friendly forces could stop them. 4,000 civilians. The fuel depot. The ammunition. Vasquez had sat in the back of the room and listened and felt something settle in her chest with a finality that she had recognized before, the particular weight of a thing that has been decided. She had not decided to stay because she was brave. She was not sure she believed in that kind of bravery, the abstract kind, the kind that people talked about at ceremonies. She had decided to stay because the math was simple. The tunnel entrance needed to be denied. The radio relay needed to be maintained. One person with a rifle could accomplish both for a limited time. She was the only person in the base whose specific skill set made that calculation viable. It was not bravery. It was arithmetic. Corporal James Whitfield had figured it out 3 minutes after she climbed the tower. He had come to the base of the ladder and looked up at her and said, in a voice stripped of everything except the bare fact of what he was saying, "You're not coming out of this." She had said, "Get to the evacuation point, James." He had said, "Tell me something I can tell your family." She had thought about it for a moment. Then she had said, "Tell them the last thing I did made sense. That's the most I ever wanted." He had stood at the base of the ladder for a long time before he left. She had listened to his boots on the frozen ground until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she had turned back to the scope and started counting footprints in the snow. Now, in the scope, she watched the man she had trusted more than anyone she had ever known walk through the blizzard toward everything she was here to protect. Private First Class Aaron Drury had died on Day 9. Not in combat. He had slipped on ice on the northern stairwell, descending in the dark to relieve himself rather than use the latrine bucket in the operations room. His neck had broken on the second concrete step. She had found him in the morning. She had wrapped him in a thermal blanket and moved him to the eastern room and sealed the door and had not gone back. That was the part of war that no one talked about. Not the enemy, not the cold. The way people died in the dark doing ordinary things. And you had to keep going, and the grief had nowhere to go except into your hands, into the scope, into the work. She kept going. She had been keeping going for 31 hours. 1 round. The valley was called the Marta Pass on the operational maps. but the soldiers who had served in the area for any length of time called it something else. Dead ground. The term had a technical meaning in military context, ground that cannot be observed or engaged from a given position, but in this case it had accumulated a secondary meaning over years of use. The valley was where things went to disappear. Patrols that entered it sometimes came back smaller than they had left. Sounds that entered it were absorbed by the ridgelines and never returned. It was also the only viable approach to Fire Base Ardent from the east. The western approach was a 300-meter exposed slope with no cover. The northern approach required crossing the Marta River, which was currently frozen but unreliably so, and which was covered by the base's remaining fixed defensive position, a remote-operated heavy weapon system that had gone offline on day 6 when its power supply failed. The southern approach was a cliff. She had used the previous 12 hours to make the Marta Pass as costly as possible. She had placed her shots carefully, conserving ammunition, targeting the natural choke points in the valley where the terrain forced the column to compress. She had not been trying to stop the advance. She had never believed she could stop it. She had been trying to slow it, to force the enemy commander to pause, to reassess, to send scouts forward, to consolidate before advancing, to do all the things that professional soldiers did when they believed there was an active threat in front of them. She had bought hours, each shot calculated, each target chosen not for the individual but for the tactical effect, the leader of a forward element, to force reorganization. The soldier in front of a natural choke point, to create hesitation. The radio operator, to break the chain of communication and make the column pause while they re-established contact. She had done this mechanically, deliberately, without hatred. That was important to her. She was not sure why it was important, only that it was. Now she had 1 round left, and the column was approximately 400 meters out and advancing with renewed confidence. Because no shots had come from the tower in the past 40 minutes, and the enemy commander, who was very good at reading silence, had clearly concluded that the sniper was either gone or out of ammunition. In the scope, she watched the lead figure raise one hand. The column halted. The lead figure turned and spoke to the soldier immediately behind him. The soldier nodded and turned to relay the instruction down the line. She knew what that sequence meant. She had been taught it. By him. Establish a command position. Assign forward elements. Prepare for entry. He was approximately 420 meters away. The wind was coming from her left at roughly 40 kilometers per hour, gusting to perhaps 60. The temperature was somewhere around -20 with wind chill. She had been awake for 31 hours. Her hands, despite the insulated gloves, had lost fine motor sensitivity 3 hours ago and had not recovered it. One shot. The probability of success was, by any reasonable calculation, very low. She breathed out slowly and pressed her cheek to the stock and waited. His name was Colonel Marcus Holt, and he was the best soldier she had ever known. She did not think about this in terms of moral judgment. The quality of a soldier at the level she was thinking about, the level of pure tactical and operational competence, existed independently of the choices that soldier made. The side he chose, the orders he carried out. She had understood this intellectually for years. She had never expected to have to apply the understanding this directly. She had last seen him 14 months ago. He had been commanding the 3rd Mountain Advisory Group, training foreign allied forces in the Valley region 200 kilometers to the south. She had been rotated home for what was supposed to be a 6-month rest and recovery period. When she had returned, he had been reassigned. She had not been told where. She understood now. The intelligence leak that Captain Yardley had mentioned. The detailed structural information about the base that had apparently been provided to the enemy. The specific knowledge of the tunnel complex that only a very limited number of people had possessed. She did not let herself follow that line of reasoning to its conclusion. Not yet. There was only one question that mattered right now, and it was not why. The why could wait. The why could wait for a long time, possibly forever. Because she was increasingly clear-eyed about the likelihood that she would be alive to pursue it. The question that mattered was, 1 round. Use it or keep it. She had been trained by him, among others, that a sniper taken prisoner was a liability to everyone. The information a sniper carried, the targets she could identify, the methods she could describe, all of it was extractable under sufficient pressure. She had been trained to understand what sufficient pressure meant, and she had been trained to understand what her responsibility was in that situation. He would know this. He had been the one who trained her. He would know, when he reached the tower, what one empty magazine and one spent casing meant. He would know she had kept one round, and he would know what that round was for. This was, she understood, with a clarity that went beyond thought and into something more physical, what he was counting on. If the round was for her, it was not for him. She went very still in the cold, and let this understanding settle through her like ice water. He had taught her to read a situation from all angles. He had taught her that the enemy commander's most important asset was their ability to predict your behavior. He had taught her that the moment you became predictable, you had already lost. She was being very predictable. She thought about James Whitfield's face at the base of the ladder. She thought about what she had told him. The last thing I did made sense. She thought about 4,000 civilians in a town called Kessler's Ridge who had no idea that the difference between their safety and a catastrophe was currently resting in the barrel of a rifle held by a woman with numb hands at the top of a crumbling concrete tower. She thought about Aaron Drury, wrapped in a thermal blanket in a sealed room, who had died doing something ordinary in the dark. She thought, this is the last calculation. In the scope, the colonel turned and looked directly at the tower. She had imagined absurdly. She knew that she might see something in his face. Recognition, hesitation, grief, something human. There was nothing. Or rather, there was the particular quality of focused attention that she had spent 3 years trying to learn and had never fully mastered. Pure assessment, no sentiment. A very good soldier. She exhaled slowly. She adjusted for the wind. The physics of the shot were these. Distance, 422 meters, estimated. The scope's rangefinder had failed on day 4, victim of impact damage from a near miss. She was working from memory. The distance from the tower to the eastern boundary marker was 400 meters even. The target was approximately 20 meters beyond the boundary marker. Wind, left to right, approximately 40 kilometers per hour with gusts. At this distance, a round would drift roughly 40 centimeters in a steady 40-kilometer wind. In a gust, significantly more. She would need to hold significant left offset. Temperature, -21 Celsius at last check, 6 hours ago. Colder now. Cold air was denser. The round would fly slightly flatter, but cold also affected the propellant. The charge was slightly less efficient, slightly less velocity, slightly more drop at range. These two effects partially canceled each other, slightly favoring the flatter trajectory. Target, a human figure in winter gear, moving slowly, approximately shoulder-width profile at 422 meters. At that distance and that profile width, a 3-centimeter error in wind compensation would result in a miss. Her hands, impaired. Fine motor function reduced by approximately 40%, by her estimate, based on her experience with cold-induced degradation over multiple deployments. The trigger pull on her rifle was factory set at 2 kilograms. She had always preferred a lighter trigger. In normal conditions, she could achieve a pull that was clean to within a few grams. In current conditions, she estimated she was working with a tolerance of roughly plus or minus 150 grams. This introduced a small but meaningful risk of pulling the shot. Her eyes, 31 hours without sleep. The scope's image was clear, but her ability to hold the reticle steady was compromised. The target was visible, but there was a slight tremor in the image that she could not entirely suppress. Probability of first round hit. By her honest assessment, approximately 45%. She had made harder shots. She had made them with 2 rounds in reserve, and a spotter calling wind and a radio, confirming the target and 8 hours of sleep behind her. She had never, in her career, attempted a shot of this significance, with these compounding variables, and no margin for error. 1 round. She thought, very briefly, about what the 45% meant for the other 55. If she missed, she still had the round. For herself, if she fired and missed, she lost both options. She thought about the tunnel under the Eastern Maintenance Building. She thought about Kessler's Ridge. She thought about Captain Yardley's voice. If they find the tunnel, they will be inside the defenses before any repositioning of friendly forces could stop them. The mathematics of this had exactly one answer. She held the left offset. She adjusted the elevation slightly high to account for the cold reduced velocity and the drop at range. She slowed her breathing to the pace she had been taught. Inhale, partial exhale, pause, press. The wind gusted. She waited. The gust subsided. 1 second of relative stillness, or what passed for stillness at -20 in a mountain blizzard. She pressed the trigger. 3 years earlier, in a different country, in the low-ceilinged briefing room of a forward operating base that smelled of diesel and coffee and institutional cleaning fluid, she had sat across a table from a man who had laid out, on a topographical map, the strategic logic of mountain warfare. Terrain, Colonel Holt had said, is the only permanent feature. Armies come and go, governments change, objectives shift, but the mountain does not move. If you understand the mountain, you understand the campaign. He had shown her how to read contour lines, not as abstract cartography, but as living geography, where the water ran, where the wind was channeled, where a natural defensive position became a natural trap if approached from the wrong direction. He had shown her how a valley that appeared to be a viable approach could become an impossible one at a specific season, how an obstacle that appeared permanent could become negotiable under specific weather conditions. He had taught her to ask, always, what does this terrain protect? What fire base Arden protected was not itself. It was not the radio relay. The relay was a secondary asset, useful but replaceable. What it protected was a geological accident of enormous tactical significance, a tunnel complex formed by the fracture and partial collapse of a limestone shelf running through the eastern face of the mountain, stabilized by decades of freeze-thaw cycles into something approaching a usable passage, and subsequently improved discreetly, over many years into a covert access route that bypassed the mountain entirely. The engineers who had improved it had not published their work. The soldiers who used it were selected carefully and briefed narrowly. She had learned about it on day 8, when Yardley finally told them. But she understood now, watching through the scope, that someone else had learned about it much earlier. She understood that the offensive, the specific timing, the specific axis of advance, the specific focus on Firebase Ardent above all other objectives was not random. It was targeted. It was the product of specific information, held by a specific person who had chosen a specific moment to make that information actionable. She understood that she was not simply defending a base. She was the last obstacle between a deliberate, planned operation and its objective, and the man who had planned it had trained her. This was not a coincidence. He had known, when he trained her, what she was capable of. He had known what would happen if she were assigned to Ardent when the offensive opened. He had either arranged for her to be elsewhere and the arrangement had failed, or she had been assigned after his departure from the advisory group, or some other variable had introduced her into the equation after he had left, or he had decided that she was a manageable obstacle. That her predictability keep one round, use it on yourself, would neutralize her at the critical moment. She thought, he made me into an instrument, and he thought he knew what the instrument would do. She thought, he was right about almost everything. The wind dropped for 1 second. She pressed the trigger. The shot broke. The recoil was familiar, not comfortable, never comfortable, but familiar in the way that anything you have done thousands of times becomes a known quantity, something your body processes without the involvement of conscious thought. She tracked through it, keeping the scope on target, watching. The wind gusted between her and the target approximately half a second after the round left the barrel. She saw the trajectory disturbed. She saw the round impact not where she had aimed, but 20 centimeters to the right and lower. The target went down. She did not know, in the first moment, whether it was a hit or a fall. At this distance, in this weather, the difference was not immediately obvious. She watched the column stop. She watched the nearest soldiers react, dropping to cover, turning, scanning, and that reaction told her what she needed to know. That was not a man who had stumbled. That was a man who had been hit. The column's forward movement stopped entirely. She watched. She had no more rounds. She had nothing left to threaten them with. But she watched, because watching was what she had. The soldiers at the front of the column clustered around the fallen figure. More soldiers pushed forward from the rear. The column compressed, losing its tactical spacing, becoming a mass rather than a formation. She could see, even through the weather, that this was a genuine reaction to something unexpected. They had believed the tower was empty. They had believed the sniper was neutralized. They had been wrong. She set the rifle down on the floor of the tower, barrel pointed toward the wall. She sat back against the concrete and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind drove snow against the walls with a sound like static. She was aware that the hit might not be fatal. She was aware that the column might reorganize and advance regardless. She was aware that she had no further ability to stop them. She had done everything she could do. This was a specific kind of peace, not the peace of safety, not the peace of success, but the peace of completion, the peace of a thing that has been finished. Whatever came next was beyond her capacity to effect, and she had learned, over 3 years of work, that regularly placed her in situations where individual agency meant very little, to release the things that were beyond her capacity. She thought about architecture. She had not thought about architecture in a long time. She thought about the way a structure had to honestly account for what it was carrying: the load, the stress, the forces working against it from every direction. A building that lied about its loads eventually collapsed. It was not a moral failing, it was physics. She thought, I told the truth about my loads. She thought, that's something. Outside, she heard the wind change pitch. Not stronger, different. The distinctive shift that happened when the storm was beginning to break up at altitude, when the main body of the system had passed, and what remained was the trailing edge, less organized, less sustained. She opened her eyes, leaned to the observation slit. The valley was empty. She looked for a long time, checking every sector, scanning the ridgelines where the enemy's flanking elements would have positioned themselves. The shapes in the snow that had been advancing for the past hours were no longer advancing. Some of them were moving. She could see that, but they were moving back, away from the base, back up the valley. She did not understand why. She pressed her forehead against the cold concrete of the wall and breathed. What she did not know, could not have known, from her position in the tower with a dead radio and no communication, was that the round had not merely struck Colonel Marcus Holt, it had killed him. The round, deflected by the wind gust to the right of her intended point of aim, had struck him at the left shoulder rather than center of mass. This should have been a wounding hit, not fatal. But the round, having been deflected, had also been slightly destabilized, a very small tumble imparted by the wind resistance, and when it struck the heavy winter jacket and the armor beneath, it had fragmented in a way that a fully stabilized round would not have. The primary fragment had transited through the shoulder joint and into the thorax. The secondary fragment had struck the carotid. He was dead before he reached the ground. Among the soldiers in the column, the effect was immediate and decisive. Not because of grief, these were professional soldiers, accustomed to loss, but because of what his death meant tactically. Holt had been the operational commander, the one with the full picture, the objective, the timeline, the knowledge of the tunnel complex that was the entire purpose of the operation. His second-in-command knew the tactical plan but not the strategic rationale. And the strategic rationale, the tunnel, the approach to Kessler's Ridge, was the thing that made the operation worth continuing. Without that knowledge, the operation was simply an assault on a fortified position in a blizzard with no known tactical objective, at the cost of whatever losses the invisible sniper might still exact. The second-in-command made the professional decision. He ordered a withdrawal to consolidate and await new orders. The column turned. This was not a defeat. It was a pause. Within 48 hours, the enemy command structure would reorganize, the intelligence would be redistributed, and a new operational plan would be drawn up. The tunnel complex would remain a target. But it was not 48 hours from now. It was now, and the valley was empty, and the base still stood. In the decades that followed, in the accounts written by the soldiers who had been in that valley, in the reconstructed operational analyses produced by both sides of the conflict, in the brief official commendation that was eventually entered into the record of Sergeant Elena Vasquez, there were different ways of describing the shot. The technical accounts described it in terms of probability, a shot taken under conditions that no reasonable ballistic model would have rated above 50%, a result achieved through a combination of precise preparation, extensive training, and the particular quality of attention that separates a functional marksman from something beyond function. The accounts from the soldiers who had been in the column described it differently. They talked about the silence before the shot, They had heard nothing, they said, as they would later say to anyone who asked. No engine sound, no aircraft, no mechanical trace of the weapon being fired. Just the wind, and then the column's commander was down. They said it was as if the mountain itself had acted, as if the weather had a will. The ghost of the snow, they said. There was no such thing, the analyst replied. The soldiers in the valley said nothing to that. They had been there. They knew what they had seen. What they had seen was this: a figure they could not locate, a shot they could not hear, and the most reliable officer any of them had served under dropping into the snow at 400 meters in a 40-kilometer crosswind in the middle of a mountain blizzard. They said it was a legend. They said it was not possible. They were saying both things at once and not noticing the contradiction. The relief force arrived at Firebase Ardent at 9:47 in the morning of the following day. They came in 3 vehicles, 2 armored personnel carriers, and a medical transport, moving carefully through the pass in the wake of the storm, which had broken entirely in the early hours. The sky above the mountains was the particular deep blue that comes only after a major weather system has exhausted itself, cloudless and crystalline, throwing the snow-covered ridgelines into a relief so sharp it looked constructed rather than natural. The lead vehicle stopped at the outer perimeter of the base, where the gate had been. There was no gate anymore. There was a gap in a crumbled concrete wall. Sergeant First Class Raymond Okafor, commanding the relief element, stepped out of the vehicle and stood in the gap and looked at the base. He had been in combat for 11 years. He had seen a great many things. He stood in the gap for a long moment before he began moving. The base was silent. Snow had covered everything during the night, smoothing the edges of the damage, filling the tracks and craters and the scattered debris of days of fighting, until the whole compound looked almost peaceful, almost like a building that had simply been closed and left. Okafor moved through the base methodically, checking each structure. The operations room, empty. Equipment destroyed, a single empty canteen on the floor. The barracks, empty, personal effects scattered, the specific kind of disorder that comes from people leaving very quickly. The eastern room, sealed, a thermal blanket visible through the gap under the door. He did not open that door. He came to the observation tower last. The tower was intact. Its damage was old concrete, scarred and patched, and scarred again over years of use, but it was standing, which the briefing had suggested was not certain. He climbed the ladder. The interior of the tower was cold in a way that felt different from the cold outside. Heavier, stilled, the cold of a space that had been enclosed with a small heat source for a long time and then abandoned. There was a smell, sweat, metal, propellant, and something else he had no name for. The particular smell of a person who has been in extremis and has not moved for a long time. The rifle was on the floor, barrel to the wall. Beside it, a single spent casing. Okafor looked at the casing for a long time. He looked at the empty magazine beside it. He looked at the ammunition carrier, systematically emptied, each individual round used, nothing held back except that one. He looked at the wall. She had used the tip of a knife or the edge of a spent casing. He couldn't tell to scratch letters into the concrete. The letters were not large. They were not decorative. They were the letters of someone who wanted to leave an exact record, who understood that the record might matter more than the writer. The inscription read, "The base still stands." Below it, smaller, a date, and a name. Not the call sign, the real name. Elena Vasquez. Okafor stood in the cold tower for a long time, with the morning light coming through the observation slit and laying a narrow band of blue-white across the floor. He did not know, in that moment, what had happened in the valley below. He would learn in the hours that followed, the enemy column, the withdrawal, the dead commander. He would piece together, from the spent casings and the trajectory angles, what had been accomplished here over 31 hours by one person with diminishing resources. He would read the operational assessment, weeks later, which used careful and measured language to describe the defense of Firebase Ardent as a significant tactical achievement that had denied the enemy access to a strategic asset and bought time for the repositioning of friendly forces that ultimately prevented a major incursion. He would think that the careful and measured language was correct as far as it went. He would think it did not go very far. What it did not capture, what careful and measured language almost never captured, was the specific quality of a decision made alone, in the cold and dark, with no one watching and no one to report to, and no reasonable expectation of outcome. The decision to use the last round for the mission, rather than for oneself. The decision that had to be made, not once, but in continuous, grinding repetition, hour after hour, every time the cold got worse, and the ammunition got lower, and the radio stayed silent, and the shapes in the valley kept coming. That was not a tactical achievement. That was something else. He climbed back down the ladder. He walked to the gap in the outer wall and stood there for a moment, looking out at the valley. The snow in the valley was unbroken white, the tracks and disturbances of the previous night already smoothed by wind and fresh powder. In the clear morning air, he could see all the way to the eastern ridgeline, nearly 2 kilometers. The valley was empty. He took out his radio. He said, "Ardent is standing." Then he said, "We need a recovery team for the personnel." And he paused. He said, "Tell command there's something up here they should see." The legend of the Ghost of the Snow had already existed before Firebase Ardent. After it, the legend became something different, less tactical, less military, more elemental. People told stories about a sniper who had held a mountain base alone against an advancing force, who had made the impossible shot in the impossible conditions, and then had, and this was the part the stories lingered on, the detail that seemed to mean the most to the people who heard them, not been found in the tower. The rifle had been found. The casing had been found. The inscription had been found. Elena Vasquez had not been found in the tower. She had been found by Okafor's medical team, approximately 40 meters from the base's eastern wall, face down in the snow, alive. Her core temperature at recovery was 28 degrees Celsius, borderline fatal hypothermia. She had a fractured rib from an impact she could not account for, possibly debris, possibly a fall. She had frostbite on 4 fingers of her right hand, which would result in partial amputation. She had, at some point after the column withdrew, climbed down the ladder, walked out of the base, and collapsed in the snow. She had no memory of doing this. The medical officer who treated her in the field, a young lieutenant named Daniel Prescott, who had been in service for less than a year, would later say that he had not expected her to survive the transport to the forward medical facility. He would say that her vitals had stabilized in the helicopter in a way that he could describe accurately, but not explain fully. He would say she had been unconscious for 6 hours, and when she woke, the first thing she had said was, "Did the base hold?" He had told her yes. She had closed her eyes again. She had said nothing else for 36 hours. The inquiry into Colonel Marcus Holt's history with the enemy command was conducted over the following months. The full scope of what he had communicated, and when, and in exchange for what, was eventually established to the investigators' satisfaction. It was not published. It was classified at a level that Vasquez, despite her subsequent awards and commendations, was never cleared to read. She did not ask to read it. She already understood the essential facts. She had understood them in the tower, in the moment she had recognized him through the scope. The rest was details. She left the service 14 months after Firebase Ardent. Her injuries had ended her operational career as a sniper. The nerve damage in her right hand made the precision work impossible. She was offered an instructor position, which she declined. She was offered an intelligence analysis role, which she also declined. She was given a full medical separation, the relevant commendations, and a handshake from a general who seemed uncertain whether he was supposed to be looking at her with admiration or concern. She enrolled, the following autumn, in an architecture program at a university in a city far from the mountains. The professors found her, in her first year, a difficult student. Not because she was unwilling to work, she was, by any measure, the hardest working person in her cohort, but because she asked questions that the introductory courses were not designed to answer. Questions about load and failure, questions about what a structure owed to the people inside it, questions about the relationship between honesty and endurance, whether a building that was truthful about its stresses lasted longer than one that concealed them. The professor who eventually became her faculty advisor told her, in their first meeting, "These are not first-year questions." She had said, "I know, I've just been thinking about them for a while." He had asked what she had done before this. She had said, "I was a soldier." He had nodded. in the way of someone who understood that this was a complete answer. She had not told him about the base. She had not told him about the shot. She had not told him about the tower and the single casing and the inscription she had left in the wall. She thought about it sometimes. She thought about the words she had scratched into the concrete with a knife in the blue-gray light of a winter dawn, with numb fingers and no guarantee that anyone would ever read them. The base still stands. It had been the truest thing she knew how to say. In her second year, she began designing her thesis project, a shelter. Not a monument, not a landmark, not a statement, a shelter. Designed to function in the most extreme conditions it might realistically encounter. Designed with no decorative elements, nothing that served appearance rather than function. Designed, above all, to be honest about what it was carrying and what it could bear. Her advisor called it the most rigorous thesis proposal he had seen in 20 years of teaching. She thanked him and went back to work. Outside the studio windows, in the evenings when she stayed late, which was most evenings, the mountains were visible in the distance, blue-white in winter, gray-green in summer, permanent in the way that only terrain is permanent. She looked at them sometimes. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. Not fear, not grief. Something closer to recognition. She knew what those mountains held. She knew what they asked. She knew what it cost to answer. She turned back to her drafting table. She kept working.